The subject of werewolves, witches and vampires has long been met with tension, suspicion and superstition. And our clan, of course, has kept stories about all of these things for generations, many of which have been lost to the hands of time of the general public. Even stories of how one might make a vampire, or perhaps how one might even find a vampire. And what may surprise you is that there are certain countries around the world, even including certain areas of the United States and the UK, where this knowledge can not only get you jailed, but in some areas of the world, it can see you executed. So with that in mind, grab a seat, my friends, grab a drink. I've got a story for you. If you were to tell these stories of vampires and how they are made in the country of Ghana, you would find yourself alongside the dozens that were executed last year for witchcraft. If you were to speak of this process of how they are made in the country of Baghdad, you might find yourself executed or imprisoned, possibly for a lifetime. There are even laws on the books to this very day in countries like Ireland and Spain that could see you thrown behind bars for spreading this very information. And in the United States of Canada, there is still the possibility of fines and potential jail time for the perpetuation of the consuming of human flesh and blood. Though it is important to note there are also some areas in the United States where that is a protected practice, and we'll get to that. But the teaching of those occult arts is still widely frowned upon in both United States and Canada as a whole. So first, let's explain what the clan considers to be a vampire. Vampires are specifically creatures that subsist off of the blood and or tissue of a living being, usually and most often human beings. They have to have some level of cognitive function, meaning that they understand that they are subsisting off of human beings, and to a degree have the idea that that is not necessarily a good thing. All the while they have to be relatively human-like themselves, and again, that's something that we'll come back to. I say relatively because as we delve deeper into these ancient tales of vampires, we're going to reach an area that might explain a little bit of where the uncanny valley comes from. Now, there are many myths in perpetuation about vampires, so let's talk about some of the common ones and where they come from and sort of get those out of the way so that we can get down to the nitty-gritty. I'm sure you're all aware of Hollywood films that perpetuate the idea that vampires are afraid of the sun, that they are grossly allergic to garlic and crucifixes, and even that they can transform into puffs of mist and even swarms of bats. There is this idea that they are eternal beings forever subsisting off of the blood of mankind and then hibernating for long extended periods while man repopulates so they can then come back and start feasting once again. Now, the reason why we're going to get all of these out of the way is because they are completely irrelevant to the stories that the clan keeps, as most of them are relatively recent by way of their development into popular culture. Now, vampires as a singular concept didn't really exist until the 1700s when the word vampire entered the English lexicon, giving form to this vague creature that had perpetuated folklore all around the world for thousands of years. Whether we're talking about the Striga of Slavic culture or the Revenant of Scandinavian myth, and even the Chupacabra of Mesoamerica. Blood-sucking killers have a long and rich history across the globe. But most of what we understand about them today is relatively recent, thanks to the novelization rise in the 1700s, thanks to the rise of easy printing, as well as the massive bang that was the film industry that began in the 1800s. Much of what we know today came as a rise of popular fiction in media, both written and visual. And getting the obvious ones out of the way first, the crucifix. Where did this come from? Well, it was long believed that the crucifix, after the death of Jesus Christ, could expel any sort of evil servant of Satan or Lucifer, and specifically anything that was of an evil spirit. So anything that could have to do with possession or possibly even the aura of an evil creature could be cast out by an evil demon, or the crucifix could cast out an evil demon in the same way that Jesus Christ had cast the evil out of the heart and souls of the sinners who he had died to save. And this sort of just haphazardly ended up translating into vampire myths. And there are a few different areas where it's believed that this stems from, but we don't have anything that is concrete 100%. This is why we believe that crucifixes get rid of vampires. It's just a sort of a culmination of cultural things that led to that belief. The turning into bats is another very simple one. Bats tended to bite people, especially vampire bats, and other large bats would tend to bite people, and they had very long, sharpish teeth. So it was long believed that these creatures were transmogrified of other larger creatures, and it was just a silly superstition that sort of perpetuated its way down and then was further emaciated into fiction and then became the solid idea that we have today, whether it's by joke in things like Adam Sandler's Hotel Transylvania or something more along the lines of an action film by way of Underworld. We still get these ideas perpetuated all throughout popular culture surrounding vampires. Now, silver and gold have long been considered to be purifying agents, and to a certain degree they are. Silver has been used as an antiseptic for a long time, and there is a substance called colloidal silver, which has often been used as a way of purifying water that was to be used for certain ceremonies and even for medical usage. And that comes from this idea of grounded metals, which has partial science roots and partial occult roots. Iron and other such ground metals were believed to dispel fairies and ghosts. And of course you have the natural element of salt, which is also believed to dispel ghosts, but it has to be natural ground salt. It can't be like purified table salt. So silver and gold fall into that category, and them being the purest and most prized of metals obviously gave a further rise to this idea that silver would obviously cast out any sort of evil creature like werewolves, vampires, and in many cases, demons. And as an interesting note, because of that purity of silver, that's also why they believed that vampires could not see their reflection, because mirrors back in the time, in the 1700s, were silver-backed mirrors. They had literal silver lining on the back, and that is why vampires would not have been able to see their reflection in that mirror, nor would ghosts, nor would any other sort of supernatural or unnatural or evil creature, because of the purity of the metal. But mirrors today are not back that way, so technically vampires could be among us everywhere and we wouldn't know. Unless they were biting you and sucking all of your blood out, then you'd probably have a fair idea that that individual was a vampire. And silver and golden swords were also often used in Nordic and Celtic myths to slay great monsters and sometimes even gods and demigods. So that gave even more credence to this idea that if you wanted to slay a monster, you use silver or gold. Now, these last two are the ones that have some level of legitimacy to them in the way that they are founded, and the first being, of course, garlic. Garlic is actually a powerful natural antibiotic, and it has long been used to combat blood diseases, and it was believed in the early era of the superstition of vampires that vampirism was either a curse or a disease of the blood, so garlic would be believed to drive out either that curse or that disease. And again, weirdly, that's one of the ones that has some level of legitimacy. If there was a vampiric disease that could go into your blood, garlic would be a hell of a way to get rid of it. And lastly is stakes to the heart. Again, that is just about do anyone in. Stake anyone at anything in the heart with anything. The chances are that's going to do them in. So yeah, that's got some level of legitimacy to it. Now that we've got the stereotypes out of the way, let's talk specifically about vampires that come from Ireland, as that's why you're all here. Vampires from Ireland and Celtic myths. Now, for those of you who get nitpicky, these are the legends as my clan keeps them. We are going to mention some of the mainline beliefs around these creatures, but this is specifically clan stories. So buckle in, here we go. First is the Dearg Due, or Dearg Due, which is the red drinker or the drinker of blood, exclusively a female fae or daemon. And the Dearg Due has always been a spirit of vengeance. Also, I want to mention the oldest pronunciation of this as Dearg Duro. So that's just for those of you who are interested in the old Celtic pronunciations of these. Well, the most common tale of the Dearg Due is to come back to life as a spirit of vengeance and take revenge on her evil, greedy, mistreating husband and usually his fresh lover and or wife. That tale again is much more mainline, and the clan records it as something a bit different. The Dearg Due is what is known as a born monster or born creature. In other words, demons that can be created through specific and trackable means. And the tradition of the Dearg Due is a very simple one. And allow me to remind you now that this knowledge is considered widely to be witchcraft and is illegal in many countries. So handle with care. And the way that the Dearg Due can be made is you take a woman before her 20th year and you feed her the blood of a dead man on her deathbed. This simple spell is believed to interrupt the process of the harbingers of death coming to collect the soul of one who would die. This would confuse them, and in order to maintain that confusion, the Dearg Due would have to drink the blood pretty much exclusively of young men somewhere in the same age range as the woman would have been when she was transformed into the Dearg Due. For if she were to bite into a man who was too close to death, the veil would be lifted and the spirits of death would once again know that she was bound for the next life, and they would track her down and remove what was left of her wretched soul. Now, this is one of 12 ways that the clan records that a Dearg Due could have been made, and they are all fairly similar, and this one, I feel, meets the meat of what it means to make a vampire. But with that said, these baby bloodsuckers are nothing in comparison to their great granddaddy, the Avatar, the great evil dwarf. Now, there are a couple of different ways that this is said. Throughout Ireland, you're going to find all different kinds of people pronounce it different ways. There are some who call it Avartach, there are some who call it Avartosh, there are some who call it the Avarta, and any one of those could be true. It just depends on which dialect you're going with. I prefer Avartok or Avarta. Now, the Avatar is often described as a flesh-eating, blood-sucking dwarf, small man, who is a magician and or wizard. So a dwarf, blood-sucking wizard. Now, for any of you who have watched my videos on the Airshi and the Leananshi and the Danishi, you know that the whole idea of the Seelie and Unseelie, the Shi, comes after the fact. The Shi, the Airshi, are the little people beneath the mounds. And that was very much an orchestrated attempt to shrink the old gods. And it's no coincidence that this great beast is called a dwarf in many of the tales, but all stories referencing him have him being gigantic, an incredibly tall and terrifying creature. Now, he is a popular monster in folklore, killed by the legendary chieftains Finn MacCool and Cathain. He was a great beast to be defeated by heroes of legend and myth, and every time that he was killed, he was always buried upside down, which is an interesting note because there are several other fae who exist or who are put to sleep upside down, including leprechauns and dryads, but that's a story for another time. In both instances with Finn and Cathain, they had to kill him several times, and after many resurrections, both ended up burying him upside down with his feet facing the sky and his head facing hell, and he then remained there permanently afterwards, or so the stories go. And again, all references to the Avatar seem to point to the idea that he was in fact a great giant of a creature, often described as towering over all other men and warriors, and being pale of flesh, and long, slim limbs with a large head, and not dissimilar from the descriptions we would get in modern folklore and fiction of Dracula and the Nosferatu. And in clan stories, the Avatar was a great giant, 10 to 15 feet tall, with a massive, strangely proportioned oversized head and large mouth with long, gangling limbs. A large, static creature that rarely ever left from his cave or walked at all. Rarely ever stood up to his full height, except for during the winter when he would migrate between caves. So clearly our clan records something different than the silly tales of the blood-sucking dwarf and the heroes who slay him, and adding to the credibility and credence of this story is the name of the grave where the dwarf is allegedly buried. The Slatavarti Dolmen, or Sla Avarta, near Londonderry, translates roughly to the giant's grave. And this is the alleged burial place of the Avatar. Now, this creature is ancient, older than the stories that remember him. A primordial creature from when the nights were dark and long and cold. Never hunting, but instead drawing people in with alluring sounds and mimicry and faint smells of pleasing aromas, giving the ambience of warmth and comfort. And when a poor unfortunate soul was drawn in by his trickery, he would swallow them whole. And within his stomach the blood would be drained from their body, their flesh would be stripped of its pigment, and all other hair and follicle would find itself gone. And then he would vomit them back up, stripped of all pigment and hair, pale and emaciated, left to wander like a mindless zombie. And it was said that these creatures looked oft human. They looked subhuman, strange and frightening. They looked like people, but with exaggerated and strange features, with a singular goal and mindset: to reclaim the blood and flesh that they had been robbed of, traveling the nights because the flesh of their bodies without its pigment was hurt by the rays of the sun, to find any victim that they might strip of their skin and drain of their blood. And like the Avatar, they were just strangely human, but not looking quite right. And this might be when we as people see something that appears human, but unnaturally so. It rises deep within us a strange fear that we refer to as the uncanny valley. However, as man mastered fire and light, the Avatar had fewer and fewer places where it could draw in and remain safe from the light and remain in the darkness and cold. And after several years, centuries of migrating through Europe, crossing from island to island, at last ending in Oslo, Norway, when all of the land where once found great bountiful feasts and dark cold caves of safety, they all disappeared. So the Avatar crawled into the great North Sea, and there he still sits to this very day, or so it would seem, and so we would believe. So if one wanted to find the Avatar, one need only dive down deep enough into the coldest, darkest parts of the great North Sea. And do you know what else hides down there in the deepest, darkest depths of the seas? Merfolk, and the strange stories that my clan keeps around these wonderful and incredible mysteries of the deep. I have a full video on here, and I suggest you head on over and check that out. I'll see you there, my friends, and until then, stay bloodthirsty, and remember, all hail the black dragons. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.